And welcome to this fourth seminar in the series of Ruination and Decay, which will be running also again in the autumn. So we'll be starting again in September and finishing with a big conference in Inverness in December. So far we've had lots of interesting talks about archaeology, about literature, about drama, and now today we're gonna talk about sociolinguistics. So I'm really happy to see so many from the kind of languages and Gaelic areas are connected in across the network here too. Yep. There's nobody here to introduce me, so I'll introduce myself as well. I am Ragnhild Ljosland and I work in the Archaeology Institute, even though I'm a sociolinguist and have been interested for a long time in minority languages. So today the talk is going to be about the death metaphor in discourse about minority languages. So when we talk about Gaelic is dying, for example, if you see that headline, why is that death metaphor there? Where does it come from? Is it helpful? Yeah, so it's headlines like these. How will we speak in 100 years? 90% of languages will become extinct. World's languages are dying. The death of language. I'm sure everybody has seen those. And it's a scary thought when you hear it, because it makes you think of all these predicted disasters that we're facing in other areas too, regarding our planet's biodiversity and rapid declines in wild animal populations and predicted extinctions such as the great panda or the polar bear. So the words that are commonly used to describe the situation for languages and for biodiversity are very similar. Just look, for example, at this. This is a quote from the introduction to a book by François Gras. It's called Language Policy Evaluation and the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. And François Gras, who wrote this, is one of Europe's leading experts on minority language issues. And I admire him very much. He's done a lot of remarkable work over many years. And in his book he presents some useful models for how to support minority languages. But here in the introduction he uses a death metaphor. The death metaphor is a prevalent image, as you can see. To this day, remarkably little is known about how to influence these dynamics. For example, in order to prevent some languages from dying out, to revitalize other languages, in order to guarantee their continuing presence as elements of mankind's cultural heritage, or to restrict the extent to which certain languages seen as predatory render other languages obsolete and squeeze them out of existence as living languages. The causal links that result in languages surviving, spreading or declining are complex, making any type of intervention difficult. At any rate, enough experience has been accumulated in the past decades to make one thing clear: the protection and promotion of threatened languages requires some careful planning. So my own interest in this topic goes back nearly 20 years to the early 2000s. And at that point, there was a broad international interest in the phenomenon of language shift, but it was called language death at the time in the media and by linguists, and the conversation spanned across many countries. So it started in America and then quickly came to involve the Netherlands and the UK and many other countries too. So it started out as a conversation between academics, but then it spread out and grew arms and legs as journalists got involved. And I came into contact with this big dialogue in 2001, when it all of a sudden, and with a lot of public noise and interest, grew a Norwegian arm or leg in this This is one of the newspaper headlines from the time. It started with the director of the Norwegian Language Council, Sylfest Lomheim, who in 2001 went to the media and proclaimed with great bravado that Norwegian as a written language would be dead within 100 years. And then my social linguistics professor went into a debate with him in the media. She shot him down in flames in a very heated public debate. That article there is from 2004. They were still at it 3 years later. That one says, language at stake. The future of our language is in danger. Those who don't know that have not paid attention. There is no law of nature that says that Norwegian written language will still be vigorous in 100 years. Whereas the first one from 2001 had the title Nådetid for norsk, which means the days of the Norwegian language are counted. No, are numbered. are numbered. So the language councils then across Scandinavia took this very seriously. And they sat down to investigate and write reports and write updated language policies to take internationalization and English as a global language into account. And these reports were not sensationalist in any way, they were very well considered, but they also used the rhetoric of natural disaster and death. Sweden was first. Oh no. I don't have a slide for that. Okay, so Sweden was first with Mål i mun, suggested action plan for the Swedish language came in 2002, and then Denmark came, and Denmark hadn't really had much in the ways of language policy before then, but they wrote one called Språk på spill, which means language at stake, in 2003. And then Norway was last in 2005. Anyway, so what are these death metaphors all about? And why is it important to notice them? I want to go to Lakoff Johnston, who wrote a book in 1979 called Metaphors We Live By, which became a very famous book for a very good reason. Because in that book they showed that humans depend on metaphors to structure our thoughts, and that again guides our behavior. So some excellent examples from their book is, for example, argument is war, which I used a few seconds ago when I said that my linguistics professor shot the language council director down in flames. And that leads us to think and behave as we're involved in hostilities when we're having an argument with somebody. So we attack the other's position, we defend our own position, and we launch attacks and we gain ground and so on. And another famous one from Lakoff and Johnson's book is happy is up. And even though we don't say happy is up in those words, we say, for example, I'm feeling down, versus my spirits rose, and she was soaring and I'm in top form, and that gets connected then to a wider more is up, and therefore more is good metaphor that we can see in, for example, our profits are up. So that becomes an up is good and down is bad metaphor. For example, in things are looking up and I wouldn't stoop at that and so on. So Lakoff and Johnson end up concluding that not just the way we speak, but the actual human thought process itself is largely metaphorical. So it shapes how we think about an issue. So for example, because of the more is up and up is good thing, we easily believe that GDP must increase, living standards must improve, turnovers must be more year by year and so on. Anything else would of course be bad. And so using one metaphor also highlights some aspects and hides other aspects of a situation. And therefore it does matter very much how we talk about minority language issues. So using the death metaphor, as in St. Gaelic is dying, that highlights the inevitability of it and hides the social linguistic changes that lie behind it, that are driven by human action. So politics, budgets, market mechanisms, attitudes, demographic movements, so on and so on. So the metaphor brings our minds over to the realm of biology and hides the structural causes. So what I'm going to do now is to investigate the history of the death metaphor in connection with minority languages and suggest an alternative way to talk about it. Going back to our figure then, 90% of the world's languages being in danger of death within the next 100 years. There's a very useful article in this Wilson MacLeod's book, Revitalising Gaelic in Scotland. I'm sure many of you have read already. In there's an excellent article by Emily McEwen-Fujita, and she traced the origin of that 90% figure. And it turns out it started in the US in 1992 with the linguist Michael Krauss, who wrote an article in the journal Language that's published by the Linguistic Society of America. And there what he tried to do was calculate how many languages are in danger by first figuring out how many languages are safe. To find that out, he pulled a somewhat random figure out of the air. He said that with 100,000 speakers, we can assume that a language is reasonably safe because of safety in numbers. And he found that around 600 languages have that many speakers. So then he compared that to the estimate total number of languages in the world of 6,000 to 7,000 and ended up with a figure that 10% of the world's languages have a safety in numbers. So that was all done with a lot of discussion and hedging, and he was very clear that the figure of 100,000 speakers was something that he had set arbitrarily just for the sake of his argument. But then this calculation started running a bit wild, to use a metaphor. So Emily McEwen-Fujita in her article has done some detective work to reveal where it went next. And next was in 1998, where there was a guy called Ken Hale who used Michael Krauss's concept and figure without crediting him. And that was also done without using any of Krauss's hedging and qualifiers and explanations. So nobody saw now that what was originally a plausible rough figure based on an arbitrary estimate, it became gospel. So that article by Hale in the next 2 years became very well known among linguists, and then around the year 2000 it was picked up by journalists. So in Britain, the link between linguists and journalists came in the form of David Crystal, who's a very well-known linguist who's very popular with the media. He wrote this book, Language Death. See the death metaphor, it has an EEG picture on it. Language Death. Also popular science magazines started picking it up. So the magazine Science ran a double article in May 2000 with a main article and a sidebar article that quoted Ken Hale and others. And in the opening sentence there was, most experts expect that at least half and perhaps 90% will disappear in 21st century. So now it's most experts, not Ken Hale or Michael Krauss. And then that was when it turned from 10% are safe to 90% are endangered, which is a rhetoric shift that statistically says the same thing, but rhetorically has a very different effect. And if you read the article by McEwen-Fujita in this book, you'll see how she traces how this happened and who's been misquoted and so on. And that went into the British newspapers. and newspapers in other countries. So the Independent wrote, most of the world's languages will vanish by 2100. The Scotsman turned it into an article specifically about Gaelic and wrote, Gaelic could die out by the end of the century if more children are not encouraged to learn the language, a leading linguist warned yesterday. The Independent of Sunday turned it into Gaelic doomed as speakers die out. And then the next quote I want to show here. It's by Gwyn Dyer. This is quoted from McEwan Fujita now. Gwyn Dyer wrote an opinion piece, and that was sold to 175 newspapers in 45 countries in July 2000. And there she wrote, as nature provides us with endless variations on a genetic theme, so the evolution of language as human beings expanded around the globe has given us endless variations on a linguistic theme, but not every sperm is sacred. Implying that language death is a natural process and that it's advantageous in the long run, just like Darwin's survival of the fittest. So it was about this time that the conversation first hit Norway and I got in touch with it, and the Language Council director connected with it. So I'm now going to leave McEwan Fujita's excellent research and just go a little bit further into what happened then and dig deeper into the death metaphor. So the premise is that language is a living organism, and therefore it has a life cycle of a living organism, and that can be studied in terms of evolution and survival of the fittest. So that idea, that goes much further back than the late 90s and the articles I've been talking about now, that this goes back to at least 1836, if not earlier. So this was an era where the natural sciences were making great advances. Newton had set out the laws of physics. Carl von Linné had classified plants. Darwin was developing his theory of evolution, showing how species develop. And all of that inspired linguists to engage in the task of comparative historical linguistics. So a leading linguist early on was Franz Bopp, who wrote in 1836, Die Sprachen sind nämlich als organische Naturkörper anzusehen, die nach bestimmten Gesetzen sich bilden, ein inneres Lebensprinzip in sich tragend, sich entwickelnd und nach absterben, which means that one must regard the languages as natural bodies which form in accordance with certain laws, carried within them an inner life principle, develop and gradually die, just like plants. Another central person of the time was August Schleicher, who elaborated further on that, what he saw as the natural life cycle of languages, which is independent of their speakers' own will or consciousness, and has their own periods of growth and maturity and decline. So then later on in the 1800s, this went on to become the neo-grammarian school in Leipzig that isolated what they call the unchangeable laws of sound change. So by comparing languages as they appear today and in their known historical forms, it identified the natural laws of sound change that allowed them to extrapolate back to older forms and all the way back to Indo-European, produce this lovely family tree. I hope you are noticing the biological metaphor again. So there's a lot of teleological thinking here, where teleology is a way of explaining change that goes back to Aristotle, who said that things consist not just of matter but also of form. So when a sapling grows, it's because it's striving towards its true form. And similarly, languages have a true form, and then they can decay from that form and then naturally die, they thought. An example of this would be the great vowel shift that happened in English in the Middle Ages between around 1400 and 1750. So if you're thinking within this paradigm, once you have this sound that we spell E-A as in seat. Sarah Jane, how would you pronounce the word seat?
Seat.
Yes, exactly. So you have a lower vowel because you have a more original or older vowel, whereas it has moved up in the mouths of other English speakers. And the structural linguists see this as a pull or push chain mechanism, but if it's changed, if for example becomes e, then what was e has to become e, and then what was e has to become I. So it's kind of pushing each other out of the way. Has nothing to do with the speakers. It's purely structure. So that's the way that these laws of sound change were working within this paradigm. So if we go back to a quote by Franz Bopp from 1836 about languages being natural bodies, he goes on to say that languages die when they become so corrupted that they no longer recognize themselves. So here's a bit about decay, becoming corrupted. They've gone past their glory or true form and become corrupted. We still see it in modern book titles, like here for example, Language Change, Progress or Decay. This is published 3rd edition in 2001. So in 2001 they're still using that metaphor for progress or decay. Yeah, another good example is in the study of the Norn language of Orkney and Shetland. The way that was studied in the late 1800s, especially by Jakob Jakobsen. He was a pioneer in the field and came from the Faroe Islands, came to Shetland and Orkney to study the old Scandinavian language here. In 1893 to 95, he was in Shetland doing field work and eventually published the Etymological Dictionary of the Norn language in Shetland. It's a tremendous piece of work. Don't want to say anything against it, but he's within these paradigms of his era. So he thinks that Norn seems to have been very gradually replaced by Scots bit by bit. It doesn't think so much of the speakers and their everyday lives and choices and so on, until the balance eventually tips in favour of Scots. And this was made explicit by a professor at the University of Illinois, George Flom, in 1926. He wrote a paper in the Saga book of 1926 that has the subtitle A Study in the Decay of One Language and Its Influence upon the Language that Supplanted It. And there he tries to estimate at what time the ratio between Norn and Scots balanced, and when it tipped and reached the, to me, surprising conclusion that it tipped around 1900. I would have said 1700 or maybe even earlier, but I don't know, 1900 he thought it tipped. And then Lauritz Renbo, as late as 1984, he was a Danish linguist, went on to illustrate that in the figure that you see on the bottom right. So even though nobody these days seem to subscribe to this very literal interpretation of languages as living organism, the death metaphor is still prevalent. So if we don't stop to think about it and say, hang on, this is a metaphor, then we're very easily taken in by it and feel that it's only natural that some languages die and others succeed and become widespread. There's another interpretative repertoire at play here, and it arose independently of this, but it interacts with it. I call that the Macpherson paradigm, or I borrowed this from my colleague Ines Kennedy, actually, who calls it the Macpherson paradigm. It's also called the Romantic Pastoral. It's it means that Gaelic is very prone to attracting newspaper headlines about dying and fading and waning and so on, because the plant metaphor and the Macpherson paradigm both meet in this Gaelic is dying image. So the Macpherson paradigm is part of the national romantic quest to find a national culture. And here in Scotland, an influential figure in that respect was James Macpherson, who wrote the poems of Ossian. So within that, the true and genuine culture, the Celtic culture, is something that can be found if we seek out the noble savages, such as the Gaelic speakers who live in the wilderness and in the beautiful highlands, the rugged land with the dark mountains and so on. And they are the tradition bearers, and the culture that they belong in is a culture whose achievement is in the past, is fairly in the past, as is fading. It's a Celtic twilight thing. It's fading further and further away from us, and only fragments of it are retained now, which can be discovered and preserved like gold dust by folk who go on round and record all songs and sayings and so on. So the dominant emotion here is melancholy. And in this frame of mind, all variation and all change is bad because it's corruption. So the 19th century antiquarians and hobby linguists went about collecting what they saw as rescuing the last remnants of the once great culture in a more pristine and homogeneous and authentic past. So the Gaelic culture was forever dying and forever fading, but never quite dead yet. I see Shuan nodding, that's reassuring, Shuan, thank you. So that view has also informed much of the public debate about the Gaelic language as well as other European minority languages, but especially Gaelic because of Ossian. So as Susan Gall points out, she's a sociolinguist, it's the vanishing primitive, the always dying out but never quite dead. So with all of this in mind, let's go back to the death metaphor as it's used today. More recent headlines. When linguists use the death metaphor, it's usually either with a lamenting tone or with a warning finger. But when journalists use it, it can be the same, but sometimes their use of the metaphor can be more graphic and lead to comparison with controversial debates, such as debates about euthanasia, patient resuscitation, NHS spending priorities, like this one. Is it, for example, worth administering expensive treatments to very old or terminally ill patients? That's a debate that the NHS and others are having. And then some of those words and phrases get picked up by the dying languages metaphor to create things like this. Brian Beacom, if Gaelic is dying, does it deserve a financial kiss of life? And there's other headlines quoting from McEwan Frieta again, like Gaelic on life support. Now Gaelic appears to be dying, but is it worth resuscitating the patient? So you can find lots of those when you start looking. I find that one that I found from the Herald especially vicious and revealing, because in addition to the direct medical metaphor about kiss of life, it also mentions social Darwinism explicitly. But perhaps we should let social Darwinism decide what happens to Gaelic. And if it has to go the way of Latin as a spoken language, so be it. So that sort of vicious article rises directly out of 200 years of using biological metaphors without stopping to think about what it's saying. So we're so used to these metaphors that we don't even notice they are metaphors anymore, and we forget to think about what rhetorical tradition it comes out of. So going back to the Norwegian Language Council again, and the director in 2001, with his first contribution to the 90% endangered debate, the Language Council director said that since all languages sprung out of a common ancestor language, but were corrupted, Babel style, due to migrations and groups of people being isolated from each other. Now that the world is more connected again, it's only natural that we go back to one global language. So he was lamenting it, but also explaining it as natural. As if diversity is unnatural and uniformity is natural. And that is social Darwinism. It's a very social variant of survival of the fittest. And there's a great sociolinguist called Nancy Dorian who has worked a lot in Sutherland with the East Sutherland Gaelic, which is a dialect of Gaelic that now has 3 remaining speakers according to Wikipedia. Don't know if Patrick or Gavin have more updated numbers there. Nancy Dorian was there in the 60s and 70s and a bit in the 80s studying East Sutherland Gaelic, and she pointed that out years previously, that she observed that subscribing to the social Darwinist paradigm leads to a certain arrogance from the speakers of the more widely spoken languages, because they come out looking like the fittest, as if there's something inherently better about the makeup of their language compared to the languages that are losing speaker numbers. And that leads us to another metaphor that's also at work here, and that is that of free market capitalist economics, where we're used to thinking of survival of the fittest in economic terms, like the fittest products, the fittest companies survive competition from others. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, famously analysed language as capital, where certain ways of using language can establish or maintain power relations and be converted to other forms of capital. So to put it very simply, if you speak in the right way, you can get a job that allows you to exercise power and earn a lot of money and to access groups or networks and so on. So inhabiting such a role also influences the way you speak, and that's an analysis that I find useful. Like, for example, speakers of many smaller languages find it difficult to speak or write in that language in academic research or in an academic context, because, among other things, the very role of expert requires you to use English. So it's very hard and takes a lot of courage to go against that expectations. Like, for example, Gavin and other members of your UCI staff do very bravely every day when they write academically in Gaelic. Because English, that expectation to use English is so strong that it's become invisible. It feels normal, it feels natural, you don't even think about it. PhD students in Norway write their thesis in English, and it doesn't even occur to them that they're writing it in English. It's just so expected. So I think Bourdieu's use of the concept of linguistic capital is useful, but there are other metaphors in circulation too that use words and images and ways of thinking from the field of free market capitalism, which are not so useful in my opinion. And I'm thinking especially of a model by Abraham de Swan, who wrote a book called Words of the World in 2001, where he gives a mathematical formula for calculating a language's communication value. He calls it the Q value. To find Q, you first take the number of speakers of that language and divide it by the total number, for example, the world's population or some closed group like the number of physicists in the world or whatever you're studying. And to that, when you have that, somebody opened a bottle now. Can you switch your microphone off, please? Thanks. Okay, so when you've done that, you get the prevalence. And then next, you have to find the centrality, and that you do by taking the number of speakers of this language who also speak one or more other languages, and divide it by the number of speakers in the world or of the total population who speak 2 or more languages. So if we apply this to Gaelic, we would take the number of Gaelic speakers divided by the world population, and then find the number of Gaelic speakers who speak another language divided by the number of speakers in the world who speak another language, and then multiply those two together to find the communication value. And what that produces is a hierarchy. But he uses a galaxy metaphor where some languages are moons and some are planets and some are stars, and English is the center of the universe. So it's a hierarchy where a speaker of Sami is inclined to learn Norwegian, German and English. A speaker of Norwegian, like me, is inclined to learn German and English. A German speaker is inclined to learn English, but an English speaker is not inclined to learn any other language, because you don't learn downwards in the hierarchy. And there is some truth in that, but it completely disregards any other motivation for learning languages than pure market economics and utilitarian calculations in a world of free market capitalism. So to conclude now, I think a better way to talk about minority language issues that lets us see clearer and feel more positive would be by challenging the death metaphor. So instead of saying that a young bilingual speaker's way of speaking a minority language is broken down or corrupted or represents decay, we must instead call it innovative or a multi-ethnolect perhaps, and see it as representing a possible future for the language. And instead of saying that a language is dying or moribund, there's other ways of describing the situation too, and a term that is widely used among social linguists is language shift instead of death. And another one that Susan Gall uses is language obsolescence. I like language shift. Sometimes we need to step away from metaphors altogether and sit down and look at the nitty-gritty. So if we lift our vision out of the death metaphor and out of the biological field, and see that where nature is causal, culture is the opposite. Culture is rooted in human action, and language is culture. So language is likewise rooted in human action, and the biological metaphor blinds us to that. Some of the human action that lies behind social linguistic change are easy to point out, like when the Norwegian state in the 19th and 20th century required all Sami-speaking children to go to Norwegian medium school. And the Canadian state required all Cree-speaking and other native First Nation-speaking children to go to English or French-speaking school. It's actions like that. But others are more difficult to spot. It's all those individual choices. Why am I sitting here doing this in English, for example? No. And for that, I found this very useful book. I just need to go off slide share again. On Language Change, The Invisible Hand in Language by Rudy Keller. It uses the metaphor created by Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher, about the invisible hand. And Adam Smith has been used to legitimate global free trade, but he never wrote about that. He wrote about the wealth of nations. He wrote about one country. He wrote, as every individual therefore endeavours as much as he can, both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labours to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally indeed neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much is promoting it. By preferring to support the domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So that means that if we want to change things on the macro level, we must influence the micro level. And if we want to understand the dynamics of language death, in inverted commas, we must investigate what's happening in a myriad of classrooms, playgrounds, workplaces, committee rooms, parliamentary groups, rugby teams, pubs, so on and so on. So Rudi Keller in this book, Language Change, the invisible hand in language expressed this process in this figure here. And he used that to explain long-term changes in language. For example, how we went from Anglo-Saxon to modern English and Scots. But I find it equally useful to use his model to explain language shift, or language death, if you wish. So the death or shift is represented in the circle on the right called explanandum. And what leads to it then? So on the left is the micro level, the everyday interactions of all the speakers. Each little actions, each of the very small everyday choices. Should I use this language or that now in this situation with these people? That word, this word. And all that is influenced by the ecological conditions, which is a total sum of the factors that influence that choice of action. So everything from official language policies to whether or not you feel your mates will approve and so on. So understanding language shift is understanding the motives and intentions and goals and convictions and so on which the actions of all these little individuals are based, and the general conditions of their actions. And then what links then that myriad of individual actions to the phenomenon itself that's arising, the language death. That is the invisible hand process, the unintended causal collective result of a myriad of actions. Because when they're under similar conditions, they go in the one direction. It's like creating a mud track across a lawn, because you crossed the lawn and you just wanted to take a shortcut. You didn't want to create a track, but you did. Yeah. So I'll end now with going back to where I started with the book Language Policy Evaluation and the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages by François Gras. He's himself an economist and describing his field as the economics of language. So François Gras identifies three major factors that influence whether people use a language or not, and he calls it the COD model, because the three factors are capacity, opportunity and desire. To use the language, people have to know it, they have to have the capacity to speak it, and they need somebody to speak it with or use it for in a situation, that's the opportunity, and they need that desire to do so. So for me, for example, my English improved dramatically when I got an English-speaking boyfriend. And now this year my German has improved dramatically when I figured out I could use it for guiding tourists around Kärkol and so on. So yeah, my boyfriend was opportunity and desire in a bundle. But building on this is Struebel's Catherine wheel model, where it points out that more learning of a language, that is increased capacity, leads to more demand and therefore more supply and consumption of goods and services in the language, and that's the opportunity, which then leads to a perception of a greater usefulness of the language, and that leads to a greater motivation to learn it and use it, so as a greater desire that leads back again to more learning of the language. So it's a positive cycle. So on that positive note, I think it's time to end, and I hope we're now all able to see through the death metaphor, see them for what they are, just metaphors, and moreover hopelessly outdated. So next time you come across a headline that says, "If Gaelic is dying, does it deserve a financial case of life?" you can see what complete crap it is. Thank you.